So most everybody is familiar with regular compression, either taking a game or files or set of files or what have you, putting them in a RAR, a 7-zip, or a zip file, and it compresses the data down so that what was, for example, taking 1 gig can now take 500 megabytes. But what most people don't realize is that you can actually apply this to your games. Now, we don't necessarily suggest most users compress their data, but in most cases, we actually think that it's a bad thing to do. And while you can compress NES or SNES games without much effort or much decompression on the other end, you're not gaining much space back in the long run, so there really isn't any reason to be doing it. You really start to save the most space once you start getting to disk-based systems, but then at that point, like I mentioned previously, you have decompression. Now this can take a long time to do, and if you just want to play your games, decompressing on the fly isn't necessarily the best situation for most users. And if you are using the decompression option in LaunchBox to decompress your games before launching them and playing them, and you're fine with that, then there really is no reason to continue on unless you're interested. So I'm not necessarily trying to change how you're doing things. If you are using regular compression and it's working for you, then by all means continue to use it. But I do want to highlight a few alternative options that doesn't use an archive process for compression and decompression to compress your games with. Hi, my name is Brad, and today on Unbroken Software Studio Tutorials, as you might have guessed, I'm teaching you all about unconventional compression. Now, this can mean a few things, but mostly it means removing data or compressing data so that you, save space on your hard drive. Now, personally, I am fortunate enough to have quite a bit of space on my computer. I have a dedicated hard drive for GameCube and Wii games, and that is so that I can load them up on my modded Wii or my modded Wii U. But I also plug this into my computer so that I can use it with Dolphin. I also have an 8 terabyte hard drive that I have all my ROMs located on, including my LaunchBox install. And actually, if I didn't use my unconventional compression methods, 8 terabytes wouldn't be enough. I am saving, I would guess, between all of my different methods of compression, I am saving about 2 terabytes of data. And that is an immense amount of data. I'm actually probably saving closer to 3 or 4, but just to be on the safe side of guesstimation, I would put myself at about 2 terabytes of saved data. Now, there are many ways of achieving this. Some are destructive, and I would very, 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 very much advise against doing something that would otherwise destroy the ROM that you have. So, as an example, I will be covering things like the PBP format. I will be covering the CSO or CISO file format. I'll be covering the GCM or GameCube trimmed file format. It's actually really an ISO file format, but there's a specific method of trimming the data. And then I will also be covering the WBFS file format. All of these file formats are archive quality dump worthy, or in more of a layman's term, it keeps the integrity internally of the file system of that ISO file or that disk image file. Instead of destroying the internal components that kind of makes the game run, it keeps everything accurate as possible. For example, some users out there will post smaller versions of games, and they've achieved this by going into the ISO and actually ripping out content. And in some cases, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Let's take, for example, Xenoblade on the Wii. Now, this game has a Japanese dub and an English dub, and some users out there will actually just completely remove the Japanese portion of the game. They'll zero out the data. So the file still technically exists as to keep the structure of the disk intact, but the information there is then forever lost on that rip. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. If you want to play with the English dub anyways, you might be asking yourself, well, why do I care to keep the Japanese portion of that disc? And to you, I say there probably isn't a reason, to be honest. If you want to remove the data, then, or you find a rip that has removed the data and you're okay with that, you play it and you move on from it. You're one and done. For the most part, you're probably, not going to care. But there are people out there who do want to keep the integrity of their ROMs. And for you, I do say if you find rips of games, or you have a rip of your game and you find that someone's removed it, or you're thinking about removing information from the disk, do keep in mind that one of these days there might not be a version of that game online that is completely intact. And of course, somebody could always just re-rip the game to be a complete version of that. But for me, there's something to be said about not removing data and trying to keep it intact as much as possible. Now, I say that and saying that I prefer them being archive quality dumps. PBPs, though, for those of you in the know, are not actually archive quality dumps. However, in this case, I justify it to myself at the very least in saying that it can be reverted. So I find that to be an acceptable version of compression. So enough of the long-winded intro. I know that is confusing, so if any of you have any questions, leave them in the comment section below. But now let's get on to how to actually do this. And this is also going to just get as complicated. So if you do have any questions about what you're about to see as well, leave them in the comment section below. I am more than happy to answer any questions that you guys have on this, as it is fairly confusing. So let's start with GameCube and Wii. So let's start with the Wii specifically. So I have here my Wii partition of that hard drive with all my games located on it. These are all compressed games. I did use the word trimmed and scrubbed previously, trimming and scrubbing. Now, trimming and scrubbing are two, well, they're actually the same. Functionally, they're the same thing, but with two different routes. While scrubbing zeroes out the garbage data, trimming actually removes or relocates the garbage data, generally speaking. So when we're talking about trimming and scrubbing, we want to make sure that we're actually scrubbing the game and not trimming the game. Scrubbing is... actually, it sounds like it's the worse of the two, but it's actually the better of the two in terms of keeping the archive quality of the game. In this case, we don't actually have to really do either of each. So we are going to be making our games WBFS, and you can see here over in the type column that these are all WBFS games, file extension games. Now this will run on a real Wii, a modded real Wii. These will run on a modded virtual Wii of your Wii U, and they will run in Dolphin. So in Wii Backup Manager, which the link will be in the description, choose a custom folder, or load from file, or under the Files tab, go to Add Files and Folder. Essentially add the ROMs that you have to the Wii Backup Manager. So I have my file here, I chose a custom folder where my Wii games are. So this is Call of Duty 3. And just for the purposes of this demonstration, I actually just pulled it off of my hard drive. This isn't an ISO file. If it was an ISO file, it would probably be closer to 4.8 gigabytes, or at least higher than the 3.61 that it currently is. But I'm just showing you for the purpose of this video. So I'm going to check the box here. We're going to hit transfer, and I can either transfer it as an ISO, a CISO, or a WBFS file. And I'm going to choose WBFS file, and then it says save WBFS files, and we're going to navigate to a location to save it. We're going to click OK, and then it's going to start transferring the file. Now this won't delete the original file, so if you are transferring from an ISO to a WBFS, you will still have both files. So for all intents and purposes, I just took this WBFS file, and you can transfer it to a hard drive like I did, which is, for a Wii or a virtual Wii specifically. I just use the USB ports and an external hard drive. But you can go from folder to folder. So I took this WBFS file and essentially, quote unquote, transferred it and compressed it to this WBFS file here. So once again, we take Wii Backup Manager, we load your ISO files in the Files tab by either clicking Add Folder or Add Files, or Drive 1 and Drive 2, and selecting a custom folder, checking off the boxes of the games that we want to convert, clicking Transfer, and then selecting WBFS file. Now, with this, I can also take the WBFS file, transfer, ISO, select a location, and then now we are converting it back to an ISO. So this is reversible, and you can see here that this is now a 4.37 gig ISO file. So this is also reversible. There might be a game or two that may not necessarily play well in the WBFS file format, but essentially if you're scrubbing a game or converting it to a file extension that is essentially scrubbing it, you can revert your changes. If you trim a game or delete the padding files or relocate the padding files, you can't revert it. So that's another reason why I generally prefer, archive quality dumps. They're reversible. So if a game doesn't play well in the file format that you've just converted it to, well, you're still good to go. And like I said about Wii Backup Manager, the link will be in the description below. And now let's move on to GameCube, which is on the same website. And it does the same thing, more or less, as the Wii Backup Manager. It scrubs the padding files out of the image. It doesn't convert the file extension necessarily. I have played around with GCM files in the past, but so this keeps it as an ISO, but still removes that garbage data. So with GameCube ISO tool opened, we're going to click on the little folder icon here. We're going to click Open ISO. I'm going to open up my Alien Hominid ISO file. So earlier I talked about trimming versus scrubbing, and in GameCube ISO tool terms, when we click on this little arrow icon here and save ISO trimmed, it's still just zeroing out the padding files and not moving them or reordering them or deleting them. I know it gets a little confusing. I just said earlier scrubbing versus trimming. Now that was in a general broad sense where I said usually it can mean this. In most cases though, I mean, that might be true. In this case, however, with this tool, trimming still is not a destructive form, because we can still save the ISO as a full size. So I can resave Alien Hominid here, and it's going to take a little while. From its 430 megabit trimmed ISO to its full 1.35 gigabyte ISO. And if it was truly reordering the data, destroying the data, and moving it in such a way that it altered the TOC to the game, you couldn't resave it back in its full size. That's not something that can actually really happen. If you've altered the internalness of a game, internalness is now a new scientific modding term, or, emulation term, you can't really resave it back as a full-sized ISO. So see, there we go. We've fully resaved it back as an ISO, and that's a decent amount of file size difference there. So with the GameCube ISO tool, when you see trimmed, don't worry, don't freak out, and it is a reversible operation. So again, some games may not necessarily play well while trimmed or compressed or zeroed out a little bit. So in those cases, reverting it back to its full size will generally fix any issues you may be having with it. And the GameCube ISO tool also extracts the information on the disk, and this is mostly pertinent for users who are into modding and hacking. For the most general end user, you really don't need these two formats. You realistically only need the regular ISO, trimmed or not trimmed versions. So now let's move on to PSP games. And for PSP, we use the CSO file format. And the program that I personally like to use, that I had the most success with, was YACC, yet another CSO compressor. Now, this is where the biggest point of contention comes with archival compression and zeroing out garbage data, or CSOing and WBFSing. And that is that these are native file formats that can be run on consoles. CSO'd files can also run on a real hacked or modded PSP 1000, 2000, 3000, and PSP Go. Though load times will be a little slower, which is a sign of actual compression going on here with the files. But it's reversible and still mostly removes the padded files. So while WBFS may not be a straight compression, CSOing is doing a little bit of the mix of the two, if that makes any sense. Again, I know it's a little bit confusing, but let's see how we take an ISO and change it into a CSO. So you'll see here that I have Fairytale Portable Guild.iso, and that is a 1.24 gigabyte file. So even if you have a game that isn't the fullest size, you can still compress it down a little bit with a CSO. So let's go ahead and open up YACC. We're going to click on the folder icon here to load a single file. I'm going to load up Fairytale Portable Guild. It's going to automatically output the CSO in the same folder, format CSO. You can also change it to a DAX or a JSO, but CSO has the most compatibility. We're going to put it on the 9th level of compression. We're going to, I'm going to give it a high CPU priority. It may make it compress a little bit faster. And then we're going to delete the ISO when completed. That's just a personal preference, but you don't have to check that box if you don't want to. So yeah, it's a little bit confusing. WBFS is mostly zeroing out garbage data in less compression. And while I said that CSOs is kind of in the same boat, it is also still doing some compression, which give a bit of confusion for a lot of people. And I can see why. Some people might ask, why not just use archives? And I think I've kind of covered that point before. The decompression kind of sucks, whereas these are native file formats that can just be straight loaded and saves a lot of time. They're just my personal preference as well. I generally prefer things as a CSO or a WBFS or a PBP, and not as a zip or a RAR or a 7Z file. All right, so it is done, And as you can see here, the Fairy Tale Portable Guild is now in a CSO, and instead of being 1.24 gigabytes or whatever it was, it's now 906 megabytes. So we have a compression rate of 71.4%. Now, I didn't drop it by 71%. It dropped it by the inverse of that, 28.6%. So that's a little bit confusing, but there you go. And you can also decompress the game if you need to decompress it if the game doesn't work as a CSO, because you are actually compressing in this case, where every game will, I think, work as a WBFS because it's just zeroing out the garbage data and not removing or changing the garbage data. This is compressing. You can uncompress it, but compressing it will sometimes make the game unplayable. In the case of I think it is the GTA Stories games for PSP, those cannot be put into a CSO, for example, because those games just for whatever reason don't play compressed. You can also run batch conversion, so we can either add files or add folder. I'm going to add files, and in my games folder you can see a couple of different files here that are not compressed, some of the GTA series, but let's take Summon Nights and DJ Max and Burnout Legends, for example. So we're going to open. We're going to put the simultaneous tasks to 2 so that it can compress 2 files at once, utilizing my multiple cores. It's going to output the files into my games folder. I'm going to delete input files, and then we're going to click on go. Oh, right. Whoops. So that is a limitation of YACC that I totally blanked on. It cannot compress, for whatever reason, a game over 2 gigabytes. So my DJ Max Trilogy, which is a 2.99 gigabyte file-sized ISO, which I don't think is the right native file size for PSP. I think that might be because it's modded. I can't quite remember. But it generally can't deal with games over 2 gigabytes. And that is why, for example, we don't use YACC for PS2s. Even though the method is more or less the same, compressing into a CSO, this only really works with PSP games. But the GUI and the batch conversion is really where YACC shines. And most CSO compressing programs for the PSP also don't go over 2 gigabytes. So it's not just a YACC problem. Other compression programs have this issue too. And yes, we are going to delete the source files. And then there we go. It was compressed at a 55% rate and a 46% rate. But as we recalled earlier, it's technically the inverse of that. So Burnout Legends pretty much went down by half. It went from about 400 to 263, or 400, whatever it was, to 263. And Summon Night 5 actually went more than half, 51.46%, something like that. Yeah, so CSOing can be a really good thing. And of course, CSO files for PSP can be run on physical hardware, like I mentioned earlier, and can be run on PPSSPP as well. On to the method for PS2, and this time we'll be taking a look at Max CSO, and unfortunately this doesn't have a nice GUI to go along with it like YACC does, but this doesn't have the 2 gigabyte file limit. So technically this will work for PSP games as well, though I haven't used it for PSP games because I like the batch conversion that YACC brings, but this is a viable alternative for PSP and the best way to go for PS2 games. So you can see here I've got Max CSO 32 EXE and Max CSO EXE. The one that's not labeled with a number, just Max CSO.exe, is the 64-bit version of this software. So do keep that in mind. If you are a 32-bit OS, use Max CSO 32.exe. I also like to do something a little bit different with this because there is no batch conversion. I wanted to make life for me a lot easier when converting all my games. So I renamed Max CSO to Max CSO ISO, with ISO separated in the title there. And in the top right, I searched for the word ISO, and this brought up a lot of different files. Obviously it brought all my files. And I changed the view to details. I'm going to sort it by size so that Max CSO is near the top. I want it near the top so that it just makes things a little bit easier. And you can see here, some of these games are actually fairly small already. Some of the garbage data has technically been trimmed, but they can be compressed a little bit further. So Army Men here is 618 megabytes. So Army Men here is 618 megabytes. In this search results view, I'm going to take Army Men. I'm going to drag it on top of Max CSO here, and it's going to run at a certain speed. It's going to show you the ratio and the percentage none. And I can drag multiple ISO files onto Max CSO, and it will do them in sequential order, but I'm just using this as an example. And any compression or even decompression methods that you use is completely subjugated to the speed of your CPU. So the slower a CPU you have, the longer the compression or subsequently the decompression will take. So do keep that in mind. And just like PSP games, compressing some PS2 games may not work in the long run. The games may not operate well. For example, there are a couple of games for PS2 that I do believe cannot be compressed. But Army Men has gone from 618 megabytes to 547. Now, granted, this was already a fairly small game, from 4.8 gigabytes to 618 megabytes, which 4.8 gigabytes would be the size of an unaltered, just a direct rip of the game, because, well, that's usually how it goes. For the most part, developers do put junk data to fill the rest of the disk. They generally, and even that, I'm hesitant to say, I've noticed that they don't usually leave the data on the disk empty. They will usually fill it. Now, there are cases where developers have left portions of the disk empty, but some developers will use the padding to their advantage for anti-piracy checks, which is another, which is usually why you don't want to remove the padding files. Removing the padding files will then also break the those types of checks, which is why also compressing the data can break some games like the GTA Stories games. They just don't want to be compressed. They just want to be left as is, but you can still lower the data by zeroing out the dummy data. It gets confusing. So now let's take a look at PBP files. Now, the program that I use for this is PX2 to PSP, and I kind of take umbrage with people who use the phrase PSX. I understand that, PSX, it's kind of the way it looks like when the PS1 boots up. But I do want to point out, because this is the first time in a while that I've actually been able to point this out, that that loading screen might say PSX, but there is a separate product called PSX. It was only released in Japan, and it played PS2 games, DVDs, and some other Japanese-only stuff. There was a product called PSX. So, for the most part, people don't conflate the two. When you talk about the PSX, most people realize you're talking about the PS1. But I do want to throw that out there. I don't know how the moniker PSX became so popular, but really, it is the PS1. So, the PS1 to PSP version 1.4.2. And that's just me being nitpicky. If you call it the PSX, there's really nothing wrong with that. I'm just being a dork. So leave me alone, internet. That said, we will take PSX to PSP.exe, and we will go ahead and open this on up. Now, this was originally developed so that you could take your PS1 games and convert them to the PBP file format for the PSP. Now, at the beginning of the video, I said that I preferred archive quality dumps. And now, technically, this doesn't preserve the archive qualityness. Neither does CSOing technically, but CSOing you can reverse. This you can also reverse as well. The other reason why I am generally more okay with using PBPs is because this is a Sony developed file extension. This is used for their PS1 on PSP or PS1 even on Vita. You know, when they ported those games and they were making them playable on PSP or Vita, they use the eBoot and PBP file formats over there. So this is just an extension of what Sony did, but, you know, taking our PS1 ROMs games and making them playable in this format. And we lucked out that the PBP files can also be played on a hacked PSP, on a hacked Vita, on a hacked PlayStation TV, and of course with RetroArch, the Mednafen PS1 core in RetroArch. I don't recall if ePSXe can utilize them. I wouldn't be surprised if it can, but don't hold me to that. I honestly don't remember. So where it says ISO PBP file, none selected, go ahead and click the three dots here. We're going to navigate to where I have my games downloaded. We're going to open up Bomberman Wars, and we can see here that this game is, well, that won't tell me, 185 megabytes. Chances are I'm not going to recover a lot of space from this game, but that's okay. Even a little bit of space can go a long way in the long run when you've done this to many games. So from game to game, the gains may not be the biggest, especially if it's already been trimmed or it's not a full disk size. So for PS1, that would be 700 megabytes. That was the full size of a disk. So even if the game isn't taking up that much data, you can still get a little bit back from it. So we're going to open up this ISO. Now, the rest of this information is generally preserved for the PSP or the Vita, like a boot warning image, an icon animation, background music, info page, background image, icon image. That is just for the PSP. So where it says output PBP folder, we're going to go ahead and select the location where I have this game downloaded. And before I go ahead and click convert, with this drop down, with the first option selected, I can select PBP file 2 and then click my three dots, select the second disc of a game. So for example, let's take Final Fantasy VII. You put disc 1, disc 2, and disc 3 here in file 1, file 2, file 3. You select the output and then you convert it, and it will actually also take all that data, save you some space, and combine the disk images. So you'll, instead of having 3 different ISO files and 3 different cue sheets, you'll have one PBP file. And it should intelligently and automatically switch disks when you get to the end, or when it asks you to switch disks. It will automatically do it for you. I do also believe that there is a button in RetroArch for this, but I believe that's only for if you have a disc 1 ISO and cue sheet and a disc 2 ISO and cue sheet. This should automatically switch, and from reports from users on the LaunchBox forums, it does seem like this is the case. So that's pretty cool. So with the files selected, with the output selected, we're going to go ahead and click convert, and it is done. There we go. We didn't save a ton, though. We saved about half, 185 megabytes to 94.6 megabytes. That's pretty cool. And it does change the name of the game. And this is also the case with GameCube games that will get changed to game.iso. As long as they're in a folder that has the name of the game, when you import your games into LaunchBox, there's an option to use the folder name instead of the file name. And that option almost solely exists for this reason. The file or the folder name has the proper name, the file does not. So that's what that option is there for, so that you use the folder name instead of the file name so that it can get imported properly, because eBoot is nonsense to the LaunchBox Games database, whereas Bomberman Wars is an actual title. So there you go. Whether you're taking the padding files of a game and zeroing out the data, keeping the file structure, albeit, but functionally removing that extra data and reducing it from its full disk size, or whether you are trimming a game, like in the terms of GameCube, or whether you're taking a game from an ISO to a WBFS, to a CSO, to a PBP file, or what have you, with, you know, a little bit of actual compression there, and maybe a little bit of dummy file zeroing. Really, there's several alternatives to gaining back your disk space. And the reason why I like these methods is because they're all inclusive, they're all native, they don't require the use of archives. They do require the use of third-party applications, but in the case of CSOs, PBPs, WBFS files, those are all natively read by the consoles or emulators. Well, PBPs are not readily readable by a PS1, but they're readable by a PSP and a Vita, which is pretty awesome as a side effect. So they're read by hacked consoles and by the emulators that you would want to use them with. And there are some emulators that will read RAR or 7-zip files, but I find this method to generally be the cleanest and most safe method of choosing to play games and still save some file space. It is also worth noting that there are other methods of compression. The other one that I kind of want to look into in the future is Ntfs Compression. Now, this is a file system level compression, so this is actually done by Windows, and it takes the directory containing your ISO and ROMs, and it will use Ntfs compression on the hard drive itself. Now, this can give you a notable space gain, and it doesn't affect emulator functionality. So you can keep the games in their native formats and use Ntfs compression. So I wouldn't be surprised if Ntfs compression also doubly works on PBP, WBFS, and CSO files. That's actually something to look into myself, which I haven't. I don't know if that works. Don't hold me to that. But when you are trimming a game and not actually compressing a game, but you're zeroing out the data in the case of GameCube, for example, I wonder if Ntfs compression can then also work on the ISOs of GameCube games. That's actually something that I would want to keep an eye out on, because you're zeroing out the data, you're not compressing it per se, so that might actually work. Double compression usually doesn't work, whereas, you know, you're converting it to a CSO, which is inherently a compressed file format, and then using Ntfs compression, that may not work. I actually have my doubts about that. It could, negligibly, but it could. GameCube, on the other hand, that's actually something that I should probably keep an eye out. That might be an update video, actually. But either way, I know that was very confusing. I apologize for the length, and I apologize for the confusion. So if you guys have any questions about anything that I covered in this tutorial, please leave them in the comments section below. If this tutorial helped you out at all, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more tutorials in the future. My name is Brad. The link to my channel is below. And if you are a Patreon producer, you are now seeing your name scroll on screen. If you'd like to get your name in those credits or the credits inside of LaunchBox, head on over to our Patreon link in the description below. At a minimum of $2 a month, you get early access to our shows, and at a higher tier, you start to unlock things like producer credits and private Discord server access. Thank you all for watching. Remember, freaks and geeks, to play more games, and we will see you next time. Have a good day.